Hello and welcome. You're watching Tigray television. Eritrean forces have conducted artillery shelling in Tigray this morning. At least 5 civilians died due to the indiscriminate attack on civilians in the town of Tigray, with 3 others heavily injured. A mother and 2 of her children, aged 5 and 7, who were displaced from Humara, western Tigray, due to the war, are among those who died because of the shelling in the town in the eastern zone of Tigray. Tigray Military Command says Tigrayan forces continue to shield joint genocidal campaign of Ethiopian and Eritrean forces. In a statement this afternoon, the command says Tigray Defense Forces have inflicted a huge damage on 49 Ethiopian and Eritrean divisions in the direction of Adwa in their attempt to control housing. The statement said Tigray Defense Forces have inflicted vast amount of damages on enemy forces in their counter-offensive in Falafel. The statement also noted that in Southern Front, 29 NDF infantry divisions, 5 divisions of Har Special Forces, as well as thousands of Amhar militia and Fano Vigilante group are repeatedly trying to break through Koram, Bertaklai, and Jarjar. The statement highlighted that there are battles underway in Dabaguna, Salakhlakha, Oromare, and other areas in northwestern Tigray. The military command appreciated the resistance of the people of Tigray in the war waged against their survival and vowed that Tigray will be the graveyard for the invaders. International Commission of Human Rights expert on Ethiopia said there are risks of further atrocities unless the ongoing fighting ends. In a briefing to the UN General Assembly on Thursday, the Commission called the situation in Tigray dire that has sealed off 6 million people from essential services. Abraham Govertensay has more.
According to a report by VOA, a commission of independent United Nations experts examining rights violations and atrocities on the war in Tigray on Thursday told the General Assembly Committee that deals with human rights that the risk of further atrocities in Tigray is on the rise without an end to the ongoing conflict. According to the report, Commission member Radhika Kumaraswamy told reporters that atrocity crimes are imminent in Tigray unless there is cessation of hostilities. VOA indicated that the report highlighted the situation in Tigray is dire, where 6 million people have been sealed off from essential services and supplies due to the blockade imposed by the federal government. It is also indicated in the report that Commission member Stephen Ratner said the Commission found the widespread denial and obstruction of access to food, medicine, and basic services amounted to crime against humanity, as well as the war crime of using starvation as a method of warfare. VOA also indicated that the 3-member commission created by the Human Rights Commission last December also found that the federal government targeted civilians in Tigray, shelling, airstrikes, and drone attacks. The report says rape has been perpetrated on a staggering scale since the fighting began in November 2020. Survivors in Tigray have implicated the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, Eritrean Defense Forces, and the Amhara militia and Fano have perpetrated the crime. Women were raped, gang raped, held as sex slaves, and violated with objects. According to VOA, the Commission underscored that because of the indicators that are now present at this particular moment in Ethiopian history and with what is going on at the moment, there is a possibility that atrocity crimes that could include genocide can happen unless the international community, the African Union, stop the hostilities. According to Betty Muringi, chairwoman of the Commission, the violations committed during the 2-year-long conflict in Tigray rise to war crimes and crimes against humanity. The report also highlighted that while the government in Addis Ababa has rejected the Commission's report, the government of Tigray takes those allegations seriously and will ensure that perpetrators will be held accountable if any. On Tuesday, African Union-mediated peace talks began in South Africa between the federal government and Tigrayan leaders. The Commission welcomed the talks, saying it hopes that they will lead to an end to the fighting, the resumption of humanitarian access, and the return of peace and security for the people.
Tigray Ethiopia peace talk is in progress in South Africa. Democracy Now! Discussed with founder of the Addis Standard, Sadalilema, on Thursday, who says cessation of hostilities must for the siege imposed on more than 7 million Tigrayans to be lifted. Zadala said the dynamics of the war has been changed into a war of survival to the people of Tigray. Abel Zagawu has the details.
The long-awaited peace talk between the government of Tigray and the government of Ethiopia is underway in South Africa. The peace talk raised optimism among millions of Ethiopians that it would end the 2-year-long brutal war in Tigray. Analysts estimate that the number of deaths in the conflict can be as highest as 800,000. Millions have been displaced, hundreds of thousands are facing famine. More than 7 million people in Tigray are under total communication blackout for 2 years. Founder and journalist of Addis Standards, Adalilema, speaks to Democracy Now! On Thursday regarding the ongoing peace talk in Pretoria, where she said cessation of hostilities is a must for the siege that has ravaged 7 million people to be lifted.
And it's also significant because on the ground, people are dying in tens every day. Tigray is literally being decimated as we watch. So the significance cannot be undermined. At the moment, it's better that we focus on the hopes that we're pinning in this peace talk negotiation. The hopes is that they will be agreeing on a cessation of hostilities, which would pave ways for access to humanitarian and lifting the siege, a medieval era siege that has been imposed on Tigray. No communication, no banking, no road, nothing. It's 7 million people completely sealed off. And so we need that to be lifted. For that to happen, a cessation of hostilities is a must to have.
Sadale said the world has failed to understand the complexity of the conflict as dynamics have evolved. She said the war has become a war of survival for the people of Tigray.
So initially, the purpose of this war was framed as a law enforcement by the federal government in containing, the TPLF leaders in Tigray. But the sheer brutality of this conduct has turned the war into a resistance by the Tigrayan people against the federal government, because the federal government had invited a foreign army, Eritrean forces, to join it, in Tigray. And it was no law enforcement. It was a war against everything that Tigray has. It was a war against Tigray's peasantry, its agriculture, its education. It was a war against its women. And so the people initially who had given it a benefit of the doubt for the federal government's attempt to enforce law enforcement in the region had risen up. They just realized that this is not a war against TPLF. This was a war against everything Tigray is. And so the dynamics of the war has evolved the last 2 years into becoming one that the Tigrayan people are actually rising up against the Ethiopian state. And this is why the war has been complicated for 2 reasons. One, it has changed, the dynamics has changed. And 2, there was a misunderstanding on how to solve this. Everybody understood this was a power struggle between former allies in the ruling party of the EPRDF. No, it was not. Initially, it began like that, but it became a war of survival for the Tigrayans and a war of control for the federal government into governing Tigray. And that's why we have seen the world failing in its attempt to solve this problem.
Asked whether the TPLF is a threat to the territorial integrity of the Ethiopian state, Sadale replied that she thinks in the contrary, that it is the federal government committing treason on the Ethiopian state.
I don't think TPLF will be taking the lead in having Article 39 invoked. Of all the parties that are functioning in Tigray, it's the most pro-Ethiopian party in my assessment. That's what's at stake. The territorial integrity issue there has been compromised by none other than the ruling party itself, the federal government, which has invited a foreign army to come and pillage and rape and kill and occupy the territorial independence of the Ethiopian state. Tigray, remember, is still a part of the Ethiopian state. So an occupation by Eritrea should be considered as an occupation of the Ethiopian sovereign state. But Eritrea is there with an explicit support of the federal government, which makes it a treason, by the way, Emmy, according to the constitution. And so this is the dynamics in play at the moment.
Human rights groups and media outlets accused Ethiopian and Eritrean forces who have been at the center of human rights violations in Tigray. Representing rights group Rita Kasai, a member of Europe Minority, makes a speech during the 73rd session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Reuters says report of a new round of sexual and gender-based violence and massacres in the newly occupied areas of Tigray have come to light. Sarah Kallali reports.
In what she calls an all-out war against an entire ethnic group, a young woman stands on the podium and recites the horrors of the 2-year-long war on Tigray.
The war in Tigray has been characterized by egregious war crimes, human rights violations, and, as per CNN, acts that bear the hallmarks of genocide. The Ethiopian government has attempted to frame this war as a domestic security issue. The involvement of foreign actors, namely Eritrea, and the systematic attacks against the civilian population of Tigray reveal it for what it is, an all-out war against an entire ethnic group. As per updated estimates of mortality calculated by Ghent University, up to 600,000 civilians have been killed in Tigray through direct killing, lack of healthcare, and famine. Credible evidence of crimes by invading forces against Tigrayans has emerged. These include wholesale destruction, looting, mass arrests, detainment in concentration camps, extrajudicial killings, massacres, and conflict-related sexual violence.
This speech was made by Rita Kaxay, a young woman coming from a minority group called Irob in eastern Tigray. Rita made this speech on the 73rd session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights held in Gambia. In her address, she recites the testimony of a Tigrayan woman that survived sexual violence, which shows the perpetrator's genocidal intent.
A particularly heinous aspect of the war in Tigray has been the widespread use of sexual and gender-based violence as a weapon of war by Ethiopian and Eritrean armies as well as the regional militias. In one survivor's testimony reported by Al Jazeera, 4 men took turns raping Akhbaret, who stated, "I begged them to stop, crying, 'Why are they doing that to me? What have I done to them?' Her attacker's response was, 'You did nothing bad to us. Our problem is with your womb who gives birth to a Yane. A Tigrayan womb should never give birth.'"
In her speech representing Omna Tigray, Rita stated as the war on Tigray continues, threat to the lives of Tigrayans has increased and reports of new massacres have come to light.
The threat to the safety and security of Tigrayans has only increased as the war continues, and reports of a new round of weaponized sexual and gender-based violence and massacres in newly occupied areas have come to light.
The speech was first interrupted by Eritrean delegation, which later rejected the accusation of Eritrean forces committing human rights violations in Tigray, claiming practice of such nature is alien to its country. Despite many reports made by rights groups and media outlets that put the allied Ethiopian and Eritrean forces at the center of human rights violations in Tigray, both countries continue to escape accountability for the many atrocities committed by their forces.
UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Situation in Eritrea said it has been more than 2 decades since journalists, political opponents, and disappeared persons are languishing in jails and incommunicado detentions in Eritrea. As Eritrea's human rights situation deteriorates, the Special Rapporteur warns that Eritrea poses a threat to the UN system and the international community. For a report by Solomon Barha, Miron Yamana presents.
UN expert reports it's been more than 2 decades since journalists, political opponents, and disappeared persons, making them the longest detained persons in the world, are flagging in jails and incommunicado detentions in Eritrea. According to the UN expert, there had been a recent and worrying uptick in arbitrary arrests and detentions against clergymen in the country. Mohammed Abdel Salam Babikher, UN rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea, in his report to the General Assembly said the continuous failure of Eritrea to cooperate with his mandate and implement the recommendation of human rights bodies calls the credibility and integrity of the entire UN Human Rights Commission into question, despite its election to serve the UN Human Rights Council for the 2-year period of 2022 up to 2024. He added, in contrary to the principle in which member countries are expected to be governed by, Eritrea has taken the advantage of its membership to the Human Rights Council by opposing the international scrutiny over violations in Tigray region and voted against the establishment of the International International Commission of Experts to investigate allegations of human rights and humanitarian law violations in Ethiopia. He also noted that the intensification of armed conflicts in Tigray, the de facto blockade by Eritrean forces, secret places of torture called villas, and the forced indefinite national conscription all contribute to violations of human rights in Eritrea. The UN expert calls for the release of children, political prisoners, hundreds who disappeared, and for those detained due to their religious belief, and allow all Eritreans to exercise for their right to freedom of religion. Eritrea has been fighting alongside Ethiopia's central government troops since the start of the war in 2020.
And that's the news for now. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.